Inside Tivoli Gardens. The DUDUS Reign. Act 1. A sigh of relief. 1994 was not a good year for DUDUS, and he couldn't have felt better than when it was over and 1995 rolled around. Call it wishful thinking or hope of a better tomorrow, but a new year came with new hope, and DUDUS's help was that the dust of the past would soon settle or die a slow and quiet death, leaving him to continue with his plan of domination. It didn't take much after the incidents mentioned in the previous chapter for DUDUS to realize that contrary to prior belief, bullets flying and people dying was not such a great idea after all. In the 80s maybe, but this was the 90s, things had changed, and the times required change also on his part, irregardless of the point he was trying to send or make. Another interesting development during this time was that DUDUS also got a crash course in the art of true power, an issue he had obviously gotten twisted prior to going up against Mr. Siaga. He could feel how he wanted to, no one was saying he couldn't, but keep it to himself. If he didn't, therein laid the problem. No one was saying he couldn't be the Don, even though Mr. Siaga wasn't all that familiar with him, nor was he, Mr. Siaga, too enthused about him, DUDUS, someone he didn't really know, except for him being Jim Brown's son, and someone he had no track record of, or with, running his political stronghold. Message sent and received: never forget that I have the power of the state. And even if what I say is not true, the minute I say it, the lights you have been trying to avoid will come on. This was the message some say Mr. Siaga sent DUDUS in 1994, with him being on top of his list of culprits. Feelings of defiance may have existed, but DUDUS got the message, loud and clear, and in response, literally became Mr. Invisible. This was a very critical time for DUDUS in other ways as well. He knew, although it wasn't official, that he was in the crosshairs of law enforcement. A lot had happened, and his name had topped the list of those accused. Mamas were aplenty and fingers were pointing in his direction. The law wanted him, and so did other opposing factions in the streets, and with Vivian now in jail, he again became a target, with questions now even being asked about who was now in charge of the shower posse, an issue again that had his name on top of the list. So needless to say, but DUDUS was not in the most comfortable of positions around this time. Tight and tricky, 1995. Although it was well accepted in Tivoli Gardens and Western Kingston at large, that DUDUS was the new Don, and thought to now be in possession of the keys to the shower posse's wealth. Contrary to popular belief, things were nowhere near what they were thought to be financially around this time, and according to some, the key reason for all the daring robberies mentioned earlier after his takeover, because believe it or not, the Don was said to be cash-strapped. What needs to be remembered and understood here, is that in 1994, DUDUS may have been DUDUS, Jim Brown's son, but he was not Jim Brown. He was not Vivian Blake either, and he wasn't even Jati. He was just DUDUS, Jim's little son, who many believe was taking on too much for his little head. But the naysayers and doubters could say what they wanted to, DUDUS was there to stay. Out of sight, out of mind. Both Jim Brown and Jati were known to have made visits to the US to check on the operations of the shower posse, a key factor that kept the machinery working like clockwork. Those abroad liked the fact that the Don wasn't just a Don in the shadows, but he was also a Don on the ground, showing up every now and then, not just to be seen, but also to solidify his position of power. DUDUS was however different. He had never left Jamaica, had no say-so whatsoever in the shower posse's activities along the way, so how could he now just assume such a vast and prestigious position of power? Many were not feeling such a suggestion. There was no doubt that posse members and affiliates abroad had their own issues to attend to. The heat was on in the US. So they weren't too particular about focusing on some Don that they didn't know, or had any reason to respect, even though they couldn't just ignore him and kick him to the curb, especially with the people of Tivoli already accepting him as their new Don. To those abroad, DUDUS may have been a don to the people of Tivoli Gardens, but he was no don to them, those on the front line in the United States, Canada or the UK. Accepting DUDUS as their don was hard. They didn't know him in that capacity. They knew Jim, knew Vivian, they even knew Jati, but very few if any of them, even knew of DUDUS, and those who did, knew him as a baby, not the general he was now proclaiming to be. So with all the familiar figureheads either gone or out of commission, this moment became extremely tricky in the financial arena. How so? Because affiliates abroad, on the front line, suddenly weren't too enthused about sending in the tributes that usually flowed like clockwork, one of the key types of fuel that runs the machinery of the garrisons in Jamaica, and even more so at the time, in Tivoli Gardens. This is how it worked. Tributes, monies etc., came into the Don, and he dispensed them. This was the usual way of operation. But with all that was happening, at this particular moment in time, compared to what would come later in his reign, money was funny, and the hands were out. This is not to suggest that around this time DUDUS was broke or anything of that nature. That was never the reality. He just wasn't able to access the full strength of his power due to a host of issues that both he nor anyone else had foreseen. And whatever funds he was able to access was not enough to do what a don was usually expected to do, especially with him having no political backative. Under different circumstances, this is when, according to the tradition of the day, the political representative would usually step up to the plate and add another notch to their belt, but this too wasn't to be. The political representative was Mr. Siaga, and the don was DUDUS. They didn't see eye to eye. They had differences, so the reality of the situation was although DUDUS was the don in name, for a moment, unknown to many, outside of Tivoli Gardens and Western Kingston, with all that was happening, all DUDUS was at this time, was, a don in name. A don with limited power, a don to a throne that he was still yet to ascend to in the real way that mattered, and a don that hadn't even gotten the blessing and endorsement of his own Member of Parliament. A key tool in the arsenal of any Jamaican don. Some say that around this time, DUDUS even contemplated and made attempts to leave the island. The heat in the kitchen was just too hot. This attempt however had dual motivation behind it. The heat was one, but DUDUS also felt as though he wasn't being given the respect due from those abroad, and this is when those closest say, he's starting toying with the idea that a visit was overdue. That thought however remained just that, a thought, because with DUDUS being the skeptic he was, he quickly found other ways around his dilemma. DUDUS remained grounded. Counter-claim. Although it has long been said that DUDUS had never been to the United States, officials in the United States tell a different story, claiming that DUDUS once lived in the US for a short period, unknown to many, and was deported back to Jamaica in 1989, after being convicted in North Carolina for possession of stolen property in 1988. Source: New York Times The Daily. May 26, 2010, if there is actual evidence to support this claim, then the situation changes dramatically, because if what the US have claimed is true, then DUDUS wasn't merely being the low-keyed son he was said to be. He had migrated, apparently leaving the island it seems, shortly after graduating high school, only to return disappointed, and more determined than ever to make a mark. And last but not least, if the claims of the US are again true, it could also serve as the reason behind the generosity and open-handed policy that DUDUS was said to extend towards those deported back to Jamaica, at times with just the clothes on their backs. Whatever the truth is, whether DUDUS did or didn't leave Jamaica, is one that will eventually unravel with time. But while that awaits unfolding, this is what has become clear, thus far. Are you me born? Are you me live? Tivoli Gardens had always been home from his birth, and if he was going to remain there, he was going to be the don that he was born to be, but he had to get back to the drawing board. That much was obvious by now. Education has always been a great divider in any society, and also in any field, and in the world of gangsters and thugs, the difference it made was equally the same. DUDUS was no run-of-the-mill thug that should have been established and agreed upon by now. He was educated, well-read, possessing what seemed like a mental scope that was beyond his physical years. A fact that came to life shortly after making a few visits back to the drawing board, which revealed exactly what it was that Mr. Seaga really had over him. Politics aside and his position, both of which DUDUS could easily duplicate, maybe not officially, but definitely on a level that was worthy of paying attention to. What Mr. Seaga really had over him, was the hearts and minds of the people. This was his edge. Mr. Seaga had been there for the residents of Tivoli Gardens and Western Kingston for as long as most of them could remember. He had provided for them and protected them. This was what gave him the edge. What had given him their hearts and minds, not just their vote, support, fear and respect. DUDUS had to fix this. The fence between himself and Mr. Seaga was broken, not destroyed, but according to all accounts, DUDUS had no interest in attending to any such repairs. Maybe it was pride, but even with his feet to the fire, it is said that DUDUS never sought to solidify his alliance with Mr. Seaga. DUDUS had always said Tivoli was his, and that wasn't going to change, and Tivoli Gardens had always supported the JLP, and that too wasn't going to change either. These were the facts and there was no denying them. And just for the record, DUDUS had no interest in changing any of that either. His grouse wasn't with the party or Tivoli. His grouse was with the party's leader, Tivoli Gardens' political representative, and his member of parliament. The plot thickens. According to a federal indictment, starting in 1994, the Shower Posse, with coke at its head, sold drugs by the ton. Estimations vary, but they all orbited around thousands of pounds of marijuana, and almost as much cocaine in kilograms, smuggled into the United States by Coke and his organization. We are not able to say if these accusations are factual or not. That's for the court of law to decide, but what we have uncovered, is that this particular period, 1994 to 1995, was a time when the drawing board became DUDUS's best friend, and he came away with what he felt was a master plan, a plan that was now anchored on much more than before. Fear and respect are good, so was votes and support, but he now wanted hearts and minds. That's what had solidified Mr. Seaga's position and his hold on power. He had the people's hearts and minds, that was the real source of his power, and DUDUS wanted all that and then some. He had found the formula, he just had to sell it to everyone else. Tapping into the reservoir of real power. It has always been and will always be about the people, in the people is where true power lies. It took DUDUS a while, but he eventually realized the importance of that simple, yet effective political life lesson, and when he did, he was ready to act. Almost instantly DUDUS embarked on a mission that found him becoming somewhat of a Mr. Seaga replica. If the power he desired was nestled within the people, it then had to be about the people. DUDUS's plan was simple, their hands were out, and he was going to fill them. Call it a reinvention of sorts, but it didn't take long for DUDUS to embark on a mission that found him literally becoming Tivoli Gardens, everyday, ever-present, member of parliament of sorts, not just the Don. Mr. Seaga had provided and protected the residents of Tivoli for most of their lives, and DUDUS was going to do just that, just on a level that had never been seen, or even attempted before. Mr. Seaga had an edge, but DUDUS also had an edge of his own. Unlike Mr. Seaga, he was there daily, visible in the eyes of the Tivoli residents, not just occasionally, and the issues of the people were constant, not sporadic, much like Mr. Seaga's visits. This was DUDUS's edge. He would fill the void left by the members of parliament and community councillors. And that's exactly what he did. The onion ring effect. At this stage DUDUS went into what many say resembled full campaign mode, still remaining low-keyed, but elevating head and shoulders above all who were in opposition to him with quickness. People were actually simpler than he had thought, and so was the purchasing of hearts and minds. One of his first moves was to start making phone calls, reaching out to those abroad. This was before the days of mobile access as we know them today. Back then most of the calls made to those overseas were done directly from the Jamaican telephone company, or made from an entity, now defunct, by the name of Jamintel, Jamaica International Telecommunications, then located at the corner of North and Duke Street, in the downtown business district of Kingston. This entity was adjacent to the community of Fletcher's Land, a known JLP-aligned neighborhood, a community once aligned to the PNP, but one which was actually realigned to the JLP, commandeered by none other than Jim Brown himself and his alleged 100-man army, years before, a factor and location which also gave DUDUS somewhat of the sense of security that he desired. Many have testified that it was no strange occurrence to see the president and his crew come through and make a few calls, incognito style. It was either that or he would need a direct line, which he obviously couldn't risk. It was either those avenues or using one of the then many illegal telephone connections that were available all across the city at the time. Yet another move that wasn't at the top of his things to do list. DUDUS may not have been known as the Don that JT was, but he was still Jim Brown's son, so he had the respect to at least warrant a listening ear, and upon utilizing the numbers which he had at his disposal, some say it was JT's phone book, it wasn't long before he had plenty of listening ears. And with one call after another producing results, DUDUS's converts mounted with quickness. Regardless how one felt or didn't. This was Jim's son on the other end of the line, not only getting familiar but making his position clear. This was the new Don calling. One may not have known him, but with both Jim and JT dead, and DUDUS assuming the role, accepted by almost all of Tivoli Gardens and West Kingston at the time, it didn't take long for others to start paying attention, listening, and understanding. And just like that, the floodgates of support opened. This bigger than daunting and bigger than all politics, cause we done see how'd it go already, dem for demself, so we a feel look out for yourself. Translated, this is bigger than donship and even politics, because we already see how things work at times. They, politician, are for themselves, so it only makes sense that we look out for ourselves also. This, it is said, was the foundation on which DUDUS's sales pitch was built. They were all on the same team, and self-security, in every which way there was, only made sense. America wasn't their home, garden was, anyone could be deported at any time. So it only made sense to build up what was theirs. This was his approach, and along with that he also provided the reassurance of security for the local family members of those who were away. They were not only guaranteed security, but were also given the comfort that their family members would be provided for in every other way, if indeed something should happen to the breadwinner of the family, a reasoning it is said, which was bought, hook, line, and sinker. In addition, it is also said that this was the time when DUDUS got one over on many of those who were abroad. This came in the form of him convincing quite a few affiliates abroad to open their doors to DUDUS's own personal, hand-picked implants into the United States. This was a new era, and DUDUS was quite aware of that. Unlike his father and brother, if he couldn't make the trips himself, hands and feet of his own influence had to be on the ground, a necessity if his plan was going to work. There had to be a fresh influx of foot soldiers on the ground, loyal to him. So was the thought, but it didn't stop there. DUDUS was a thinker, and was quite aware that eventually, it was going to seem as if they were there to take over. He knew that they would come, but he also knew what the end results would be on that fateful day. The older guard would either line up or act up, either way showing their hands, which would obviously be dealt with accordingly. DUDUS knew that with people on the ground who actually knew him, his people, his friends, his guns, individuals who had seen him in action, respected and feared him, things would soon be different. And like a calculated equation solved, DUDUS again proved that he was right on the money. And just as he had predicted, with the previously mentioned achieved, his implants infiltrating, things changed with the quickness, a clear indicator that those who doubted him, had indeed underestimated him. Making what he had in his hands work, could be considered the key to DUDUS's success. And after breaking ground for what was to be the ultimate takeover, his next move was to make sure the message he was preaching made its way home, from all possible angles. Almost instantly, there was what could be described as a deliberate show of generosity on DUDUS's part. But who was complaining? He was singing a new song, Money Over War, and with him being as free-handed as he had suddenly become, the blinkers were on. Almost everyone became a convert, believer, disciple or some type of partisan. His efforts were all well received by those who benefited, and it also came with the dual benefit of convincing those abroad that this young Don, who they may not have known, was indeed what he proclaimed to be, the truth. With DUDUS reinventing himself after being labeled public enemy number one by Mr. Seaga himself, then rising to the top of his game with literally no political blessing, truth be told, everyone was looking at him a bit different now. He had beaten the odds, gaining a level of legitimacy that brought him within arm's length reach of what he was yearning for, way faster than even he himself had estimated. He was the new Don, and he wasn't just talking good, according to all accounts, he was actually doing good. The streets were talking, plus the fact that he was even willing to stand up to Mr. Seaga, and say what most were said to have been thinking, but not brave enough to utter from their lips. Couple all that with what he was really doing, and you have a formula for respect and adoration, the likes of which had literally never been seen before. Actions have always spoken louder than words, and DUDUS's actions were reason enough to make it clear that he was the real deal. He was Jim Brown's son, a real coke. The tributes rolled in, and DUDUS did just like he said he would do, gaining the respect of those abroad even more, while all the time, getting closer and closer to his goal, the hearts and minds of the people. He settled every issue, looked out for everyone. He was seldom ever up front, but if you lived in or around said community, at that time, one thing was sure. You knew who was in charge, and in one way or the other, benefited from the trickle-down effect. They bought what he was selling, and with that, things suddenly became easier. Soon there was little hesitation to any suggestion DUDUS made, which led to developments such as visas being purchased either on the black market, or other ingenious ways devised for his cronies to enter the territories of choice, which in the majority of cases, was the United States or Canada. DUDUS's campaign for the hearts and minds of the people went into overdrive upon achieving the above, and soon saw him devising ingenious and elaborate schemes that always seemed people-oriented, and in almost all cases, funded by his cronies abroad. The people were bought. DUDUS went above and beyond what any other Don had done before, even doing what the people complained about, regarding what the politicians should have been doing, but weren't. Needs and wants, DUDUS provided both. He held treats for the children, paid school fees, provided uniforms, books and other school supplies, even going as far as creating a school fund that supported almost every household in Tivoli Gardens at one time or another, during his reign. Call it a third world mentality, or one embraced by the downtrodden and the underprivileged. But this was what the residents from places such as Tivoli Gardens expected from the likes of their politicians, a literal no child left behind effort. But this wasn't a political effort, nor was it even from a politician. On the contrary, this was an effort on behalf of their Don. And they embraced it wholeheartedly. Efforts like this made life easier for parents, and made DUDUS a hero amongst the masses. Taking the burden of responsibility off them, the parents, was like a dream come true in their depressing economic conditions, and in what many have labeled their stupor of dependence, and their lack of discipline to both refuse and despise the free ride. The residents of West Kingston bought into DUDUS's philosophy, lock, stock and barrel. There was even a system devised to assist with the basic necessities of all households inside Tivoli Gardens. If you were sick and needed help, there was help. Somewhat of an internal insurance fund of sorts. If you were violated, you didn't deal with it yourself, you reported it and it was dealt with. After a report, involvement on your part was none nor by choice. It may not have made national headlines, but to the residents of Tivoli Gardens, there was finally a system in place that made sense, finally a system in place that worked. Those abroad were pleasantly surprised, and the contributions, support and bond, became both greater and stronger. Tivoli was working, fueled by illicit funds sent home from illegal activities of those abroad. The entire community was happy, felt safe and provided for, and with DUDUS constantly outdoing himself with one community project after another, the likes of which never faced objection from the people, the financial tributes flowed in unreservedly, giving DUDUS access to a continuous and steady flow of funds, which added to his power tenfold. DUDUS orchestrated the accumulation of clothing and footwear in all sizes and styles, constantly, and distributed them throughout the community without prejudice or reservation. When it was Christmas, he played Santa; when it was February 14th, he played Saint Valentine; and when it was back to school time, he played Daddy, and even on birthdays or other special occasions, the president was there. Nothing was ignored. Nothing was left to chance. His plan was working, so much that it even caught the attention of Mr. Siaga himself, who by the time realized what was happening was too late in his reaction. The horse was already out the gate. DUDUS was in charge, and although Mr. Siaga may not have approved, it was clearer than ever that Jim Brown's baby boy wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. He was the people's choice, and like it or not, Mr. Siaga was going to have to deal with him. There was just no way around him. Whatever really happened next has remained a matter of speculation, but it was at this time that it is agreed upon by most in the know, who mostly all agree, that this was when Mr. Siaga lost control of Tivoli Gardens and West Kingston on a whole, forever. The change went ignored to those on the outside, but to those on the inside, a lot had changed. So much, that Mr. Siaga's role in Tivoli Gardens was reduced to a mere figurehead. But why? Simply because DUDUS was now in possession of the deeds, which Mr. Siaga had once been the sole proprietor of, the hearts and minds of the people of Tivoli Gardens. Mr. Siaga had always been a masterful politician, so although his back was against the wall, he sure as hell wasn't going to just sit back and allow DUDUS and his cronies to push him out of the very place he had not only built, but conceived and brought to life through blood, sweat and tears. If he was the people's choice, then so be it. According to sources, this seemed to have been the conclusion that Mr. Siaga arrived at, after careful analyzing the situation. He was a politician, so he was quite aware of the rules of engagement. No dummy to garrison politics, Mr. Siaga knew he couldn't continue to show direct opposition to his Don, even though DUDUS wasn't really his Don. That could spell trouble, not to mention not looking unified to the wider cross-sections of society, and to make it even more complicated, Mr. Siaga knew that DUDUS was also aware of this.